In the final years of World War II, a single aircraft quietly emerged as one of the most powerful machines ever built, not just to fight a war, but to end one. It was called the B-29 Superfortress, and at first glance it looked like just another bomber. But everything about it was different, bigger, smarter, more advanced than anything that had come before. The B-29 wasn't just an upgrade, it was a leap into the future. It was the first bomber with pressurized crew compartments, allowing its crew to fly higher than most enemy fighters could reach. It carried remote-controlled gun turrets, operated by analog computers, something almost unheard of in the 1940s. And it had an incredible range, capable of flying thousands of miles across the vast Pacific Ocean without stopping. This wasn't just a plane, it was a flying fortress designed for a new kind of war. But its story didn't begin with glory. In fact, the B-29 program was one of the most expensive and complicated military projects of the entire war, even costing more than the Manhattan Project at one point. Engineers struggled with overheating engines, mechanical failures, and deadly crashes during testing. Pilots feared it, mechanics fought to keep it alive, and yet the United States poured everything into it, believing that this aircraft could change the course of the war. By 1944, that belief was put to the test. The B-29 was deployed to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan had reached a brutal stalemate. Island by island, battle by battle, progress was slow and costly. American commanders needed something that could strike directly at the Japanese mainland, and the B-29 was their answer. At first, the strategy focused on high-altitude precision bombing. Flying above 30,000 feet, the B-29s targeted industrial sites, factories, and military installations. But there was a problem. Strong jet streams over Japan scattered the bombs, making accuracy nearly impossible. Missions failed, results were disappointing. Something had to change. So the strategy shifted, and what followed would become one of the most devastating air campaigns in history. Instead of flying high above the clouds, B-29 crews were ordered to fly low at night, carrying incendiary bombs designed to ignite entire cities. Japan's urban areas were largely built from wood and paper, making them extremely vulnerable to fire. The goal was no longer precision, it was destruction on a massive scale. On the night of March 9, 1945, hundreds of B-29s took off for a mission over Tokyo. What happened next was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Waves of incendiary bombs rained down, igniting a firestorm that consumed the city. Temperatures rose so high that people suffocated in the streets. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. By the end of the night, over 80,000 people were dead, and Tokyo was left in ruins. And that was just the beginning. In the months that followed, dozens of Japanese cities were subjected to similar attacks. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. One by one, they burned. The B-29 had transformed from a high-tech bomber into a weapon of overwhelming destruction. It didn't just hit targets, it erased them. But even after all this devastation, Japan did not surrender. The war dragged on, and American leaders faced a terrifying reality. An invasion of Japan could cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. They needed something decisive, something that would end the war quickly. And once again, the B-29 was chosen to deliver it. In August 1945, a specially modified B-29 named Enola Gay took off from a remote island in the Pacific. Its mission was unlike any before it. On board was a single bomb, one that carried the power of the atom. As the aircraft approached the city of Hiroshima, there were no swarms of bombers, no massive formations, just one plane. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb was released. Seconds later, a blinding flash lit up the sky. The explosion that followed destroyed nearly everything within miles. Tens of thousands of people were killed instantly. 3 days later, another B-29 carried out a second mission over Nagasaki. Another bomb, another city devastated. The world had entered the nuclear age, and the B-29 was the aircraft that made it possible. Within days, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The B-29 Superfortress had done something no other weapon in history had achieved. It didn't just win battles, it ended a global conflict. It demonstrated a level of power that forced nations to rethink war itself. But behind that victory was a darker truth. The same aircraft that represented technological brilliance had also delivered unimaginable destruction. Entire cities reduced to ashes, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and a new kind of fear introduced to the world, the fear of total annihilation from the sky. At the height of its power, the B-29 stood as America's ultimate weapon, a symbol of dominance, innovation, and overwhelming force. But as the war ended and the world began to change, a question quietly emerged. What happens to a weapon so powerful when the war it was built to fight is suddenly over? Because the story of the B-29 didn't end with victory. In many ways, that was only the beginning. When World War II finally came to an end, the United States found itself in a position no one had fully prepared for. Victory had been achieved, but it came with an unexpected problem. There were simply too many weapons, too many machines, and too many aircraft built for a war that no longer existed. Among them was the most advanced bomber ever created, the B-29 Superfortress. At the peak of production, nearly 4,000 B-29s had been built. Factories had worked around the clock, pouring enormous resources into their construction. Each aircraft was a technological marvel, but also incredibly expensive and difficult to maintain. During the war, that cost didn't matter. Survival was everything. But now, with peace declared, priorities changed almost overnight. Suddenly, the same aircraft that had been considered essential became a burden. The U.S. military began rapidly downsizing. Thousands of soldiers were sent home, budgets were slashed, and the B-29, once seen as the future of air warfare, was now viewed as an oversized, costly relic of a conflict that had just ended. Keeping such a massive fleet operational required time, manpower, and money, resources that the government was no longer willing to spend at wartime levels. So a decision was made, quiet, practical, and incredibly drastic. The majority of B-29s would be scrapped. Across the United States, vast storage sites began to fill with aircraft. One of the most famous was located in the Arizona desert, where the dry climate made it ideal for preserving metal. Rows upon rows of B-29s stretched as far as the eye could see, their silver bodies reflecting the harsh sun. From a distance, it looked like an endless sea of abandoned giants. But these weren't just stored. Many were being prepared for destruction. Crews were assigned to strip them down, engines were removed, equipment was salvaged. In some cases, entire aircraft were cut apart, their pieces sold for scrap metal. It was efficient, it was systematic, and it was happening at a staggering scale. To those involved, it felt like the end of an era. These planes had crossed oceans, survived enemy fire, and carried out missions that changed the course of history, and now they sat silent and forgotten, waiting to be dismantled. What made the situation even more surprising was how quickly this shift happened. Just months earlier, the B-29 had been one of the most closely guarded and valuable assets in the U.S. military. Now it was being discarded as if it no longer mattered. Part of the reason was technological momentum. Even as the war ended, engineers were already working on newer, faster aircraft. Jet engines were beginning to replace propellers. The future of aviation was changing rapidly, and the B-29, despite its advanced design, was already starting to look outdated in comparison. But there was another reason, one rooted in human nature. After years of global conflict, there was a strong desire to move on, to leave the war behind, to reduce the massive military machine that had been built and return to normal life. In that atmosphere, holding on to thousands of heavy bombers felt unnecessary, even excessive, and so the dismantling continued. In the Arizona desert, the sight became almost surreal. Perfectly functional aircraft, many with barely any flight hours left in them, were lined up and left to decay. Their tires slowly deflated under the heat. Dust gathered on their wings. Paint began to fade. It was as if time itself had paused, freezing them in place between past glory and an uncertain future. Yet not everyone agreed with what was happening. Some mechanics, pilots, and officers looked at those rows of B-29s and saw something very different. They didn't see obsolete machines. They saw potential. They understood what these aircraft were capable of: long-range missions, heavy payloads, unmatched reach, capabilities that no other bomber in the world could match at that time. And more importantly, they began to ask a dangerous question. What if the peace didn't last? The world in 1945 was far from stable. Alliances were shifting. Tensions were already beginning to rise between former wartime allies. The Soviet Union, once a partner against Nazi Germany, was quickly becoming a rival. And while the war had ended, the possibility of another conflict, one even more destructive, was starting to feel real. If that happened, would the United States regret destroying its most powerful bomber? At the time, few people at the highest levels were thinking that far ahead. The focus was on reducing costs, simplifying logistics, and moving forward. But on the ground, among the people who had worked with the B-29, there was a growing sense that something important was being lost. The aircraft sitting in the desert were more than just machines. They represented a strategic advantage, one that could take years to rebuild if it was thrown away. And yet, day by day, more of them disappeared, cut apart, melted down, erased. It was a moment of quiet contradiction. The most powerful bomber fleet in the world, reduced not by enemy fire, but by its own creators, not in battle, but in peacetime. But just as it seemed inevitable that the B-29 would vanish almost completely, something unexpected was about to happen. Because in the middle of all this routine destruction, one voice, small, almost insignificant, was about to challenge the decision. And that voice would change everything. By the time the mass scrapping of B-29s was in full swing, it seemed like nothing could stop it. Orders had been given, budgets had been approved, and the machinery of demobilization was moving forward without hesitation. Day after day, more aircraft were stripped, dismantled, and erased from existence. To most people, it was just part of moving on from the war. But not everyone saw it that way. Among the crews working in the desert storage fields, mechanics, engineers, and ground personnel, there were individuals who understood the B-29 in a way few others did. They had worked on these machines, repaired them under pressure, and seen what they were capable of. To them, the idea of destroying such a powerful aircraft felt deeply wrong. One of those individuals was a mechanic, not a general, not a politician, just someone who spent his days maintaining aircraft far from the decision-makers in Washington. But he had something that many others didn't at that moment, a clear sense of what might be coming next. He had been watching the global situation closely. The war was over, but the peace didn't feel stable. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was already beginning to crack. Political tensions were rising, trust was fading, and beneath the surface, a new kind of conflict was starting to take shape. This mechanic understood something simple but critical. If another war came, and this time between superpowers, it wouldn't look like the last one. Distance would matter more than ever: speed, payload, the ability to strike deep into enemy territory without warning. And in that moment, there was only one aircraft in the U.S. arsenal that could truly do that at a global scale: the B-29. Watching these bombers being destroyed, he began to feel that the United States was making a serious mistake.
not just wasting resources, but potentially weakening its future security. The kind of capability the B-29 provided couldn't be easily replaced. It had taken years, billions of dollars, and immense effort to build. If it was lost now, rebuilding that strength later could take far too long. So he decided to do something unusual. He wrote a letter. It wasn't long, it wasn't filled with technical jargon or high-level strategy. It was direct, almost urgent. In it, he warned that scrapping the B-29 fleet could leave the United States unprepared for the future. He argued that these aircraft should be preserved, not destroyed, that they represented a unique advantage in a world that was already becoming uncertain again. And somehow, that letter made its way up the chain of command. Eventually, it reached a U.S. Air Force colonel. At first, it might have seemed like just another opinion from someone on the ground, but something about it stood out. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the clarity of the argument, or maybe it was the uncomfortable truth behind it. Because by late 1945 and into 1946, the global situation was already shifting faster than many had expected. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. Former allies were becoming rivals. Intelligence reports hinted at growing military capabilities on the other side. And while the United States still held a monopoly on nuclear weapons, there was no guarantee that advantage would last. The colonel began to reconsider. What if this mechanic was right? What if the B-29 wasn't just a relic of the past, but a critical asset for the future? The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of scrapping all the aircraft, why not preserve a significant portion of them? Keep them in storage, maintain them just enough so they could be activated if needed. It would cost less than rebuilding from scratch, and it would ensure that the United States retained a long-range strategic capability. It was a shift in thinking, from short-term savings to long-term preparedness. The decision wasn't made overnight. There were still pressures to cut costs, to reduce the size of the military, to focus on peacetime priorities. But the argument for preservation was gaining strength. Slowly, quietly, the course began to change. Orders were adjusted. Not all B-29s would be destroyed. Some would be kept, stored carefully in the desert, protected from the elements, ready, if the need ever arose, to return to the skies. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no headlines announcing the change, no public recognition of the mechanic who had sparked the idea. In fact, his name would remain largely unknown, but his impact was real. Because of that single warning, hundreds of B-29s were spared from destruction. And in the years that followed, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to rise, that decision would prove to be more important than anyone could have imagined. The world was entering a new era, one defined not by open war, but by the constant threat of it, a Cold War, where power was measured not just by armies, but by the ability to strike anywhere on the planet at a moment's notice.
By the late 1940s, the world had changed again, and this time it wasn't a sudden explosion of war, but a slow, growing tension that seemed to stretch across continents. The alliance that had once defeated Nazi Germany was gone, replaced by suspicion, rivalry, and fear. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood on opposite sides of a new kind of conflict. There were no massive invasions, no clear front lines, but there was something far more dangerous: the constant possibility of nuclear war. In this new reality, power was no longer measured only by the size of an army or the number of tanks. It was measured by something else: the ability to deliver a devastating strike across vast distances at any moment without warning. And suddenly, the B-29 Superfortress became one of the most important tools in that strategy. The aircraft that had nearly been scrapped was brought back into focus. Preserved in desert storage, many of those B-29s were now reactivated. Crews returned, engines were checked and repaired,
Systems were brought back to life. What had once looked like abandoned machines slowly turned into an operational force again. But this time, their mission was different. During World War II, the B-29 had been used to destroy cities and force surrender. Now it had a much more complex role, to prevent war from happening at all. This was the beginning of nuclear deterrence. The idea was simple but terrifying. If one side had the ability to launch a nuclear attack at any time, the other side would think twice before starting a war. Peace, in a strange way, would be maintained through the threat of total destruction, and the B-29 was at the center of that strategy. At the time, the United States was the only country with operational nuclear weapons. But a bomb alone wasn't enough. It needed a delivery system, something reliable, long-range, and capable of reaching deep into enemy territory. And once again, the B-29 was the only aircraft that could do it effectively. These bombers became part of a new kind of military force. They were kept on alert, ready to take off at short notice. Crews trained for missions that they hoped would never happen. Routes were planned, targets were selected. Everything was prepared in advance. It was a different kind of pressure, not the chaos of combat, but the quiet tension of knowing that at any moment the world could change forever. As the Cold War intensified, the B-29 also began to evolve. Engineers worked to improve its performance, leading to upgraded versions like the B-50, a more powerful and refined successor that carried forward the same basic design. These aircraft extended the life of the original concept, adapting it to the demands of a rapidly changing world. But even as new bombers were developed, the original B-29s were still needed. And then, in 1950, the fragile balance of peace was shattered. War broke out on the Korean Peninsula. Once again, American forces were called into action, and once again, the B-29 found itself flying combat missions. But this was not the same war as before. The skies were no longer uncontested. This time, enemy jet fighters, faster and more advanced, posed a serious threat. The B-29, once nearly untouchable at high altitude, was now vulnerable. Missions became more dangerous. Some aircraft were shot down. Crews faced risks that hadn't existed just a few years earlier. The world of aviation had changed, and the B-29 was beginning to show its age. And yet, despite these challenges, it continued to play a critical role. It carried out bombing missions against strategic targets, it supported ground forces, and perhaps most importantly, it remained a visible symbol of American air power, proof that the United States could project force far beyond its borders. At the same time, the larger strategy of nuclear deterrence continued to grow. New weapons were developed, new delivery systems were designed. Jet-powered bombers began to enter service, gradually replacing the older propeller-driven aircraft. The B-29 was no longer the future, but it was still part of the foundation. It had bought time for new technologies to be developed, time for strategies to evolve, time for the United States to build a more advanced and flexible military force. Looking back, it's hard to ignore the irony. Just a few years ago, these aircraft had been sitting in the desert waiting to be destroyed, seen as unnecessary, outdated, too expensive to keep. And yet, when the world entered one of its most dangerous periods, they were exactly what the United States needed. They became a bridge between two eras, from World War II to the Cold War, from conventional warfare to nuclear strategy. And while newer bombers would eventually take their place, the role of the B-29 in those early Cold War years was undeniable. It helped define a strategy that would shape global politics for decades. A strategy built not on fighting wars, but on preventing them through the threat of something far worse. Because in this new world, the most powerful weapon wasn't the one that was used, it was the one that never had to be. As the years passed and technology continued to advance, the B-29 Superfortress slowly began to fade from the front lines of military service. Jet-powered bombers were taking over the skies, faster, higher flying, and far more difficult to intercept. Aircraft like the B-47 and later the B-52 would redefine what long-range bombing looked like. Compared to them, the B-29, with its propellers and World War II origins, seemed like a machine from another era. And yet, its influence never truly disappeared. Because the B-29 had done something far more important than simply fight a war. It had changed how wars would be fought in the future. It introduced the concept of true intercontinental reach, the idea that a nation could strike an enemy thousands of miles away without ever setting foot on its soil. It proved that air power alone could cripple an entire country's infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, it became the first aircraft to deliver nuclear weapons in combat, marking the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter in human history. Everything that came after, every strategic bomber, every nuclear doctrine, every long-range strike capability, traced its roots back to the lessons learned from the B-29. Even its design left a lasting mark. The pressurized crew compartments, the focus on high-altitude performance, the integration of advanced targeting systems, these ideas would become standard in future aircraft. The B-50, a direct evolution of the B-29, carried that legacy forward, while newer bombers built upon it in ways that engineers in the 1940s could only imagine. But while its technological impact was undeniable, there was another side to its legacy, one that was far more complex. The B-29 was not just a symbol of innovation. It was also a symbol of destruction on a scale the world had never seen before. The firebombing of Japanese cities had already shown how devastating modern air power could be. Entire urban areas reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. Tens of thousands of lives lost in a single night. And then came the atomic missions, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, events that would forever be remembered as both the end of a war and the beginning of the nuclear age. These moments forced the world to confront a difficult reality, that human technology had reached a point where entire cities could be destroyed almost instantly, that the line between victory and catastrophe had become dangerously thin, and that future wars, if they ever happened on the same scale, could threaten not just armies, but civilization itself. In that sense, the B-29 didn't just change military strategy, it changed how humanity thought about war. As the decades went on, the aircraft itself became rarer. Most of the original B-29s were eventually retired, scrapped, or lost to time. The vast desert storage fields that once held hundreds of them slowly emptied. What had once been a massive fleet was reduced to just a handful of surviving airframes. But a few were saved. Today, some B-29s still exist in museums and private collections, carefully restored and preserved. A small number have even been returned to flying condition, maintained by dedicated teams who understand the importance of keeping history alive. When these aircraft take to the skies, they're no longer weapons of war, but reminders of a past that shaped the modern world. Seeing one fly is like watching history in motion. The sound of its engines, the shape of its wings, the sheer presence of the aircraft, it all connects directly to a time when the world stood on the edge of something unimaginable. And it raises a question that still echoes today. How close did it all come to being forgotten? Because not long after World War II ended, thousands of these aircraft were on the verge of disappearing forever, scrapped, melted down, erased as if they had never existed. It would have been easy, practical, efficient. And if that had happened, the early years of the Cold War might have looked very different. The United States might have entered that uncertain period without one of its most important strategic tools. The development of nuclear deterrence could have been slower, weaker, or more vulnerable. The balance of power might have shifted in ways that are impossible to fully predict, all because of a decision made in peacetime, and all because of what seemed at the time like a simple question of cost and necessity. But history didn't go that way, because someone looked at those aircraft and saw more than just machines. They saw potential, they saw the future, and they chose to preserve it. In the end, the story of the B-29 Superfortress is not just about war. It's about the choices made after the war. It's about how close the world came to discarding one of its most powerful creations, and how that decision, quietly reversed, helped shape the balance of power for years to come. From the skies over Japan to the silent tension of the Cold War to the museums where it now rests, the B-29's journey is a reminder of something deeper. That even in moments of victory, the decisions that follow can be just as important as the battles that came before. And sometimes the difference between forgetting history and preserving it comes down to a single choice.